In the previous videos we learned the 150 attack. A very effective attack method against Indian defenses. In this video you will learn how to attack when the opponent does not allow you to occupy the center with your pawns. White starts the game with the move d4, placing a pawn in the center. Black plays a knight to f6, developing a piece and taking control of the e4 square and preventing white from occupying the center with his pawns. Now white cannot advance his pawn to e4. Therefore, white continues with knight to f3, developing his king's knight towards a good square, from where he takes control over the central squares. g6, black wants to play the king's Indian defense. The idea is to develop the king's bishop through the fianchetto, where it will be very well placed, since it will occupy the large diagonal of dark squares and exert pressure in the center, and at the same time will protect its castling. Knight to c3, white develops his queen's knight towards its natural square, and takes control over the e4 square. Now white is threatening to occupy the center with e4. d5. Black places a pawn in the center and increases control over the e4 square, to prevent the opponent from occupying the center with his pawns. How can white continue his plan of attack? No problem. Bishop to f4. White develops his bishop to a good diagonal. The idea of this move is to aim for the c7 pawn. And, in the next move, white will be able to advance his pawn to e3, which will leave the bishop active outside the pawn chain. Bishop to g7. Developing the king's bishop and preparing to castle. e3. Strengthening the defense of the d4 pawn and allowing the development of the king's bishop, which is the last minor piece yet to come into play. Black castles. Now white knows where the black king lives and can direct his attack against the enemy castling. Bishop to e2. Completing the development of the minor pieces. White develops his pieces apparently calmly, but in a few moves he will be ready to launch a fierce attack on the king side. The bishop on the e2 square avoids the pin with bishop g4 and aims for the h5 square. The scheme is completed. White's plan is to move his queen to castle on the long side. He will place his knight on the e5 square and then advance with his pawns on the king side, to attack against the opponent's king. This is called the berry attack. The difference with the previous videos in which we learned the 150 attack is that now the black pawn is not placed on d6, but is on d5. When the black pawn is on d6, then it controls the e5 square, but allows the occupation of the center by the white pawns. While if the black pawn is placed on d5, then white cannot occupy the center with his pawns, but instead he can use the e5 square with his knight. Let's see an example game. b6. Black wants to make the move c5 to attack against the opponent's center and try to obtain counterplay. Knight to e5. The white knight occupies a good square in the center and at the same time releases the action to the bishop on e2, who can support the advance with h4 and h5. The attack begins to take shape. Note that the white king is not castled yet, but he is not in danger in the center, since there are no open lines and the center cannot be opened at the moment. Since the white rook has not been castled, it can support the attack along the h-file. Therefore, in this system it is important to delay castling for a few moves. c5. Black hits in the center to try to open lines and counterattack against the white king, who is still in the center without castling. h4. White now launches the pawns to attack. His idea is to follow with h5 to open the h-file for attack. The white king is not afraid to stay in the center because at the moment he is not in any danger. If black wants to stop the attack with the move h5, white will be able to prepare the break on g4 using moves such as queen d2, f3, g4, and so. Bishop to b7. Black develops his bishop and takes control of the c6 square before developing his queen's knight. h5. The white pawn has already contacted the opponent's castling pawn barrier and threatens to capture on g6 to open the h-file. Capturing the pawn would be a disaster. Because after knight takes pawn. Then bishop takes knight. G takes h5. And after queen takes h5, white has a decisive attack. Knight to c6, completing the development of his minor pieces and attacking the e5 knight, which is a very strong piece. H takes g6, opening the h column for attack. H takes g6, recapturing towards the center to try to reinforce his position. Bishop to b5, threatening to capture the enemy knight. It would not be good to capture the knight on e5, since after knight takes knight, then white recaptures with the pawn and black's knight on f6 has to abandon its excellent defensive position. Queen to c8. Defending the knight and aiming towards the g4 square, to try to also defend on the king side. Bishop captures on c6. Eliminating an important piece that attacked the center. One of the best techniques to win more games is to eliminate the opponent's active pieces. Queen to f3. Incorporating the queen into the attack on the king side. With very natural and simple moves, white gradually increases the pressure. C takes d4. Eliminating the opponent's central pawn, with the idea of opening lines on the queen side and trying to create counterplay. E takes d4. b5. Advancing on the queen side. Black desperately tries to attack on the other flank, but his attack is late. g4. Adding more fuel to the fire. White attacks with all the pieces. Bishop to b7. Releasing the action to the queen along the c-file, to try to attack on the queen side. White castles on the queen side. With this movement he achieves several objectives. On one side he defends the c2 pawn and at the same time puts his queen rook into play, which was the last piece left to enter the fight. Now, advancing with b4 achieves nothing since the knight defends itself with knight to a4 and will be able to access the c5 square, which will be an excellent position in the enemy camp. Queen to e6. Queen to h3. Moving the queen to the h-file. Now, the black knight cannot move because he has to defend the h7 square, to avoid an eventual checkmate. Bishop to c8. Trying to eliminate the attackers to try to defend. Bishop h6, penetrating the enemy castling and threatening to eliminate the bishop on g7, which is a key defender of the opponent's king. One of the most effective techniques for attacking is to eliminate the opponent's key defenders. Invasion along the open h-column is decisive. For example, in case of b4 it follows bishop takes on g7. And after king takes g7. Queen h6 check, and after king to g8. Queen to h8 is checkmate. Knight to h5, blocking the h-file, with the idea of preventing the attack. Black takes advantage of the pin along this diagonal. Now you have to pay attention, don't capture the knight because you would lose your queen.
Oh no!
Bishop captures on g7. Eliminating the best defender of the enemy king. It is not possible to capture with the knight since checkmate follows. King takes g7. Queen to h4. Coming out of the pin. Now, the dark knight is attacked. It is not possible to move the knight with knight to f6, because it is still checkmate with queen to h6 check. And after king to g8, queen to h8 is checkmate. f6. counterattacking against the white knight. If white captures the black knight, black will be able to capture the white knight. But knight captures on g6, completely destroying the defenses of the enemy king. It is not possible to capture the white knight with king captures on g6 because checkmate follows, queen takes knight check, and after king to g7. Queen to h7 is checkmate. Queen captures on g4. Black tries to exchange queens to repel the attack and avoid mate. But, thanks for the free rook.
Thanks so much.
Knight takes on f8. White has a decisive advantage. After queen to f4 check. King to b1. Black resigned. Summing up. Place a pawn in the center. Then develop your two knights towards their natural squares. If black does not prevent it, on the next move you can occupy the center with your pawns. If black prevents you from occupying the center with your pawns, then develop your queen's bishop outside the pawn chain. Develop your king's bishop towards the e2 square, from where it points to the h5 square. Jump with the knight to e5 and you will be ready to launch a strong attack against the kingside.